All right. So basically, we're going to talk about the hips today. We're going to move up the chain. Well, the hips are basically, as Gary Gray would say, they're the power source of the human body. They're the main power source that creates, that transfers energy down through the legs into the ground, allows to run and jump. And they're the power source that takes energy from the ground and dissipates it before it actually gets up into the superstructure. So when we describe the hips, we're going to basically describe the femur on the pelvis. Those are the two bones of the hip joint. Okay. Now, a little quick blurb about the pelvis is, when we usually talk about the pelvis, we usually break down the bones into the ilium, the ischium, the pubic bone, even the sacrum and the coxsacrum. But those bones are basically fused together by the time we get 18, 20, sometimes even 24 years of age for males. But those bones fuse together at the ilium, the ischium, and the coxsacrum. They form basically one bone. Now, they are basically functionally work as one ring around the sacrum and the coxsacrum. Okay? Now, functionally, they kind of function as one ring. Now, we know there's a little bit of play between the SI joint, 1 or 2 degrees, and there's a play between the pubic symphysis. And if you really have dysfunction, those two joints can become really irritated. But they basically are becoming irritated because forces aren't being transferred to allow the pelvic bone, the pelvis itself, to function as one ring. Lenny Paracino, out of California, he has this theory or phenomenon, and he calls it the pelvic ring phenomenon. So, if we're looking at the hip joint, we're saying that's the femur and the acetabulum of the pelvis. Well, the acetabulum is actually made up of the ilium, the ischium, and the pubic bone. But those are all fused together. We're looking at them as one ring. So my right hip is my right femur and pelvis, and my left hip is my left femur and pelvis. So basically both hips are described by the pelvic bone. So if the right hip is the pelvic and the pelvis and the femur, right femur, and the left hip is the pelvis and the femur, well, movement of the pelvis can affect both hips. So my contention, and most contentions of people in AFS, Applied Functional Science, is that there is no difference between the right hip and the left hip. They're the same thing because we function upright. So when I move my pelvis, I have movement in my left hip and my right hip at the same time. So restrictions in both can affect each other. Now, if I lie you on the table, the way we normally do is we lie you on the table and we move around your femur, around your pelvis on your right side, and then we move your femur and your pelvis on your left side, and we say, oh, it's your right hip that's the problem. Well, when we function, that right hip restriction is going to affect the loading of my left hip. So functionally, I'm going to develop a left hip restriction and a right hip restriction. It doesn't matter because we're looking at it in function. Okay? So I'm going to go over a couple of quick things here. And I know I'm kind of rushing because I only have 10 minutes for these videos. But let's say I want to look at frontal plane movement of my hip joints. So I want to look at AB and adduction of my hip joints. Well, a good way to do it is if I can say, I'm putting my feet straight together and I'm going to look at how the pelvis moves on the femurs, right? So when I move my pelvis this way, I'm creating an adduction of my right hip, but that's also a abduction of my left hip. So if I'm restricted in abduction of my right hip, my pelvis won't go that way. Therefore, it's going to limit adduction on my right hip. Okay? So if I'm moving my pelvis in the frontal plane, you can see how both hips respond to each other. Now, if I go wide with my feet, say I'm in a defensive stance in basketball or something like that, and I start swaying, I'm going to have way less motion. But what's limiting that is more of my abduction on my left hip here than my adduction of my right hip. And vice versa this way. And the reason why is because I've already used up some motion by pre-positioning my feet into abduction. And that's going to actually be a way to evaluate the abduction of my hip. If I create a driver and see how far I can translate one way, then how far I can translate the other way is going to see how much abduction I get on my hip. And vice versa if I go narrow. So if I'm swaying my hip this way, now if I lose motion of my pelvis going to the left, it's probably going to be caused by left hip adduction restriction than right hip abduction restriction because I pre-positioned my feet or my femurs into adduction. So That's kind of a way to kind of fish that out. Same way in the transverse plane. Let's say I want to look at internal and external rotation, right? I want to look at this motion, okay? Well, if my feet are straight ahead and I just see grossly that I have less pelvic rotation to the right than to the left, well, that can be caused by restrictions in right hip internal rotation. So my pelvis is moving about my femur, or left hip external rotation. Okay? And vice versa if I go this way. This is left hip internal rotation, right hip external rotation. Okay? Now, a way to fish that out is, what if I toe out a little bit more? And I go and I see less pelvic rotation this way than this way. Well, I would probably assume that that's going to be more left hip external rotation restriction than right hip internal rotation restriction, because I biased the external rotation. I've already pre-positioned an external rotation. Now I'm saying I need more external rotation, so I'm going to get to that limitation more. Okay? Now if I bias external rotation on my right hip, I should see more internal rotation motion available. Okay? And vice versa if I go toed in. So if I go toed in, I'm pre-positioning my hips into internal rotation. Well, if I have less motion going this way than this way, I'm probably going to say that's probably caused by a right hip internal rotation restriction. Okay? So, that's a way to kind of view it in the transverse plane. Now, it works the same way in the sagittal plane. So, let's say I have my feet facing forward, and I want to look at walking, running, anything like that. Well, if I take my right hip forward, or my right leg forward, and my left leg back, well, my right hip is more flexed now. My left hip is more extended. Okay? So, if I try to drive further flexion, and I just feel jammed, or I can't reach down as far, or I'm getting more lumbar lordosis or whatever, I'm definitely getting an evaluation of how well my right hip goes into flexion, all right? Then my left hip going into flexion, because I've already pre-positioned it into extension. Same way as if I reach back and I try to create extension out of my hip, I'm posteriorly rotating my pelvis, that's going to be measuring left hip extension more than right hip extension, because I pre-positioned it that way, and vice versa. So that's a quick little screen for hip assessments and function, instead of lying them on the table and getting all these goniometry measurements and all that, which really, I mean, those are just normative values. They don't really mean anything. That we want to evaluate how this works and function is an easy way, is just to say, you know, I'm going to put you in this position, and I'm going to drive you in the transverse plane, you know, with an arm driver or just a pelvic driver, and I'm going to say how well, you know, what is the qualitative rotation of the pelvis or about the femurs? What is that doing down to the feet? You know, because when I rotate this way, that's going to create a chain reaction down the feet, which is going to actually supinate or invert this subtalar joint, evert this subtalar joint. Okay? So, but basically, that's in a whole other talk. So we're going to see how the pelvis rotates about the femurs, what's the limitations, and I can kind of sniff that out by using my tweaks of toed out and toed in to see which hip is restricting that motion more. I can do the same thing in the frontal plane if I go wide, or if I just drive in the frontal plane first, and if I want to see if it's an abduction restriction, I would go wide. If I want to see if it's an adduction restriction, I would go narrow. And then the same thing in the sagittal plane. If I want to measure flexion and extension, I can see how well I flex and how well I extend my hips, but if I want to isolate out a hip more, still in an integrated manner, would be to, if I put my right leg forward and I go this way, I'm probably measuring more my right hip flexion. And if I extend more, I'm measuring my left hip extension. Well, if I want to measure left hip flexion, I would just switch my stance. Left hip flexion, right hip extension. Okay? So there's a simple side hip screen. All right? The next one I'm going to go over is hips and kind of motions and what restricts motions and loading motions and things we see commonality-wise. Okay?